advocate for expanding financing for climate change funding that directly supports tribal climate resilience and mitigation projects across Indian country. I want to first address community relocation emergencies and their associated project costs. These projects are devastating tribal nations across Indian country as they work to combat the climate crisis. My nation, the Quinault Indian Nation, knows this all too well. We are located on the southwest corner of the Olympic Peninsula of the state of Washington along the Pacific Ocean. Since time immemorial, my nation has relied on the waters of the Quinault and Queets rivers and the Pacific Ocean for sustenance and survival. The village of Tahola is the primary population, social, economic, and government center of our nation. In 2012, my nation began developing a master plan for relocation of our residents, businesses, and institutions of Lower Tahola to a new village and higher ground. This master plan involves multiple federal agencies, including DOI, HUD, and Interior, and has an estimated price tag of $150 to $200 million. And Quinault is only one example of several tribal nations working to relocate their communities across Indian country. We at NCAI applaud the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which passed a $130 million set aside for tribal community relocation projects. This is the first federally established community relocation fund that is specific to Indian country. So it is crucial that members of this committee consider establishing a federal relocation framework for tribal relocation efforts and promote the need for meaningful tribal consultation on the implementation of the infrastructure package's $130 million tribal relocation fund. In order to adequately address the climate crisis, we must collectively look to engage with our international parties. Many tribal nations, tribal organizations, and NCAI are longstanding international climate change partners. Just this past month, we attended COP26 as the Article of the Paris Agreement, Article 6, which addresses market and non-market approaches to climate change, were negotiated. On November 13th, Article 6 was adopted, with many of our positions included in the final text. I'm happy to discuss this further, and I appreciate the time and opportunity this morning. And again, thank you for convening this very important and critically timely session. Siakwil, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, President Sharp. And it was very apparent at the COP26 in Scotland, the growing impact and influence of Indigenous peoples from the United States, but all across the globe. So we are going to talk a little bit more about that. Next, Chairman Baker, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Chairman Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the Select Committee. My name is Melvin J. Baker. I am the elected chairman of the Southern Indian Tribal Council, the governing body of the Southern Indian Tribe. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on the tribe's efforts to protect the environment while utilizing the tribe's energy resources to support a broader mission around the energy transition and carbon neutrality. All modern economies require a reliable and affordable energy supply, and in turn, energy development has an environmental impact. The fact is, we must embrace innovative ways of thinking to solve problems for our future generations. The environmental impact that is receiving significant attention today and is the subject of today's hearing is the effect of energy development on climate change. The challenges around the current trajectory of increasing CO2 emissions in the Earth's atmosphere are real. We must work together globally to implement change that puts us all on a path to carbon neutrality. So CO2 levels in the atmosphere don't continue to increase as a result of the human activities on Earth. We must also be mindful that while we solve these challenges with climate change, it is not at the expense of other aspects of the environment or the standard of living we strive to provide to our tribal members. We support a holistic approach to climate change by leveraging natural resources in each region where energy is developed to reduce carbon emissions on tribal lands within the United States and around the world. With many well-meaning ideas and proposals introduced nearly every day, we cannot allow policy changes to exclude technological nor advancements because they are not considered renewables, nor can we expect export carbon emissions from one area of the country to another or even to a different part of the world, as our Earth has one atmosphere. A holistic approach to carbon emissions delegation of federal environmental programs and project life cycle, environmental impacts require transformation of future business and energy development to address climate change and other environmental or cultural impacts. America remains a land of innovation and technology advancements, including methods to tame climate change in ways that do not result in deterioration of our material standard of living. One example of our tribe managing energy resources on the reservation is our methane capture project. Methane and CO2 naturally seep out of the ground on parts of the reservation where the fruitland coal seam comes to the surface, also known as outcrops. From 2008 to 2018, the tribe successfully implemented a project that included a collection system to capture these gases and allowed us to sell over 420,000 metric tons of carbon credits associated with the project. This was possible because personnel from our tribal government, tribal business, industry, and academia supported the project. We are now working on an enhanced version of this project with deployment of newer technology to increase the amount of methane captured. Another example of our tribe partnering with others to provide solutions in our involvement is the Coyote Clean Power Project. Our partnership with 8 Rivers Capital will pursue the development, construction, and operation of a net power plant that utilizes innovative technology to produce 284 megawatts of electricity from natural gas while capturing and storing CO2 emissions. Net Power continues to advance their technology towards commercial scale deployment. In fact, this portion of the testimony has been recently updated to highlight the critical milestone reached where the Net Power test facility in Texas has successfully delivered electricity onto the grid. The commercial scale facility planned on the Southern Indian Reservation will be the first of its kind and can provide carbon neutral baseload power to support a reliable grid as more coal power plants are retired and intermittent renewables are added. If Congress had not supported the renewable tax credits, solar and wind would not now make up 10 to 15% of today's US supply to the electrical grid. We encourage Congress to consider increasing the value of carbon credit associated with 45Q legislation to expedite deployment of carbon capture infrastructure and new technologies that can be part of the future solution to a carbon neutral environment. The tribe's history with environmental stewardship and energy development both on and off the reservation is vast and unparalleled. This includes development of one of the first utility-scale solar farms in Southwest Colorado, the recovery of naturally venting methane and other alternative projects such as biofuels. The tribe is interested in pursuing projects that continue our long legacy of leadership, vision, and environmental stewardship by collaborating with stakeholders who share the same vision to develop and commercialize real-world solutions for the energy transition. Thank you for the time today to testify before you today and for your interest in the Southern Indian tribe. At this point, we would be happy to answer any questions you may have, and I do have some staff from our energy department in the room with me. So thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Baker. Next, we'll go to Dr. Thornbrew. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing. Natasawi's Casey Thornbrew, Ganu Thomas Masipia. My name is Casey Thornbrew, and I'm a citizen of the Mashi Wampanoag tribe. I live on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, on the original homelands for those of us who call ourselves Wampanoag, also known as Wampanoag, the people of the first light. It's important to acknowledge that several tribal nations on the Atlantic seaboard refer to ourselves as people of the morning, people of the dawn. USET is a nonprofit intertribal organization serving 33 federally recognized tribal nations, from the northeastern woodlands, south to the Everglades, and across the Gulf of Mexico. Climate change will have lasting impacts on tribal lands, seascapes, waters, and communities. As the First Nations of this continent, tribal nations have witnessed and adapted to changes in the climate that have occurred over millennia. However, tribal nations now face a rapidly changing climate while working to protect the health and well-being of our communities, lands, and waters on a fraction of our original homelands. Since the start of the 20th century, the average annual temperature in the US has increased between 1.2 and 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. However, northeastern areas of the USET region have observed an increase of 3 degrees. Although these may seem subtle, they are reflected in notable changes in ecosystems and weather patterns. Over the past 100 years, global sea levels have risen 7 to 8 inches, and this has also been seen on the Atlantic coast in our region. However, with sinking land in coastal areas and damage to coastal wetlands, some areas in our region, especially in the Gulf, have seen sea level rise of 1 to 3 feet. Future projections indicate that sea levels will rise another 1 to 4 feet, with an 8 to 11 foot rise possible by 2100. My background shows a salt marsh, which is one of the few places our tribal nation can access to fish, shellfish, and practice our culture. A 1 foot sea level rise it could survive. An 8 foot sea level rise would put it underwater. Specific changes in our region also include the Gulf of Maine as one of the fastest warming body of waters in the world. Warm water marine species are showing up in the Gulf of Maine and staying longer in the summer. It's uncertain if the Gulf of Maine will remain suitable habitat for cold water species for future generations. And for tribal nations, it's not just about species. They are our relations. We are culture related. They are traditional foods. They are also in the namesake of some of our tribal nations and some of our clan kinship networks. In the Southeast, landfall of higher category hurricanes has impacted the infrastructure and safety of USET tribal nations. Tribal emergency response and public safety are increasingly having to respond and prepare for such events. Tribal nations across the USET region have experienced more extreme weather events in areas and during seasons for which they have been historically less frequent. Tribal nations are working to become more resilient to the impacts of climate change. Currently, there are over 60 climate change adaptation plans with more to come. However, there are barriers to tribal climate adaptation planning, such as competitive funding for tribal climate resiliency projects. Also, the 2009 Carcieri Supreme Court decision challenges our ability to have lands placed into trust, even when those lands are on tribal homelands and territories. Thus, tribal nations may face difficulties if adaptation means relocating or reacquiring lands. With regard to relocation, such a term is profoundly sensitive for tribal nations, given our experiences with forced relocation and removal from our homelands. It is understood that climate change impacts are going to require the movement of communities and infrastructure in some places. However, tribal nations must be afforded the dignity and the means to move to preserve the well-being of our nations, and as well as our rights to our ancestral places, which must be maintained even if these places become submerged. USET supports the administration's new initiative, Elevating Indigenous Knowledge in Federal Policy Decisions. Tribal nations have lived sustainably in our ancestral homelands for countless generations, relying on our traditional ecological knowledge, TEK. This has led to practical solutions improving forest management, wildlife corridors, and dealing with sea level rise. However, TEK must be respected and protected as tribal proprietary knowledge. This is important because tribal nations and cultures carry the responsibility of its application. In conclusion, it is important for the United States to meet its trust and treaty obligations to tribal nations through ensuring accessible long-term funding for tribal climate change adaptation. Also critical is removing the barriers that tribal nations face while upholding our right to free, prior, and informed consent. Kataba Tanamu, I thank you all for your time and for this opportunity to testify before you today.
Thank you, Dr. Thornbrew. Next up, Ms. Thomas, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Good morning, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Graves and honorable members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide, to provide my views on Indian country's substantial opportunities to contribute to this nation's efforts, ambitious efforts to reduce carbon, to better prepare and adapt to the now too real impacts of climate change on tribal communities. Certainly coming on the heels of the now enacted Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, this hearing is timely and important to identify the critical role the federal government can play and should play in supporting Indian tribes, Alaska Native villages, and other indigenous communities in the strategies and actions necessary to protect these vulnerable communities from the worst of these impacts. Let me start with the good news. According to a recent analysis by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in 2018, Indian country has over 6% of the total technical and economically feasible renewable energy resources in the United States. And that's compared to having about 2% of the land mass. So clearly an outsized amount of resources that tribes have with respect to solar, wind, biomass, geothermal, and hydroelectric. Despite having almost 21,000 terawatt hours of potential generation capacity, which is more than enough power to power the whole United States multiple times over. There are only 2 commercial scale renewable energy projects operating on Indian lands. So Indian country's clean energy resources can and should, and in fact must be brought to bear on the United States efforts to reduce its carbon emissions if the nation is going to succeed at meeting its commitments to future generations and the world in mitigating climate change. Furthermore, these resources can be brought to bear on tribes and Alaska Native villages' efforts to protect themselves from climate change through the use of these same resources in distributed energy projects, whether that's rooftop solar, community solar, microgrids, and as a way to enforce and reinforce energy self-sufficiency, energy sovereignty, but almost more importantly, from a climate change perspective, energy resiliency and reliability. But these goals can only be accomplished through mass deployment of these types of technologies. With the plummeting costs, especially around solar and storage, federal support, such as additional technical and financial assistance, can be more impactful and more meaningful. But while this federal support is necessary, it's not sufficient. Leveraging these kind of resources can still be very expensive. Distributed energy projects, of course, while again, we're reducing costs, the cost of storage is still relatively high. The cost of microgrids is still relatively high. Even Blue Lake Rancheria, which President Sharp referenced in her testimony, the only tribe with 2 actual working microgrid facilities and used for energy resiliency, were still multi-million-dollar projects. So the challenge for tribes and the federal government is how can we take advantage of other financing opportunities, public-private partnerships to see more mass deployment of these efforts, of these types of technologies from an energy reliability standpoint. How do we focus on what would be critical infrastructure, especially schools, hospitals? We saw how important it was, of course, to have robust public health systems in the last year and a half with COVID, how important it was to have robust water, wastewater, and other types of public health infrastructure, which of course cannot operate without energy. How do we protect government campuses, our tribal enterprises, and fisheries and farms, everything that does in fact still require power and is at the most vulnerable with respect to climate? A couple of key challenges that we still have and still remain is from a community scale perspective, a distributed energy perspective, is the exercise of tribal sovereignty over that development. And so Congress and the federal government can really assist tribes with promoting more interaction at the state level, promoting more tribal sovereign authorities over the exercise of energy development, and providing more technical and financial resources. And so with that, again, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks to all of the witnesses for their very insightful testimony. And thank you for getting up early for our witnesses from the West Coast, especially. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes to kick off the questioning. Well, all of the witnesses have really highlighted the enormous opportunities that a clean renewable energy brings to tribal lands and tribes and to all of us across this country. What I've heard from you is that clean and renewable energy will create jobs, it'll lower cost, it'll clean up the air, it'll reduce pollution, and provide health benefits in areas of the country that really need it. So President Sharp, you're a leader in this. What do we need to do in tribal consultation to really bring these opportunities to Indigenous peoples across this country?
Yes, I really appreciate not only the question, but your remarks in the opening statement. The issue of free, prior, and informed consent and the ability for tribal nations to have a decisive say That's something that I've started to advocate and advance as a policy in which nobody has to give that to us. We're not seeking FPIC from state agencies and federal agencies. The idea that a tribal nation, like any other governmental body, should have a decisive say over our land, territories, and resources is an international standard that transcends national borders. And for tribal nations to be able to seize the opportunities that Pilar had mentioned, when you look at the opportunity that we have to unlock within Indian country, there is no question that tribal nations, in assisting and partnering with the United States to unleash and unlock the energy potential within this country, we should have a decisive say. And so it is critically important that as we build out our climate strategies, that tribal nations are able to exercise the full spectrum of governmental powers, authorities, and decision-making.
Ms. Thomas, you make a very compelling point about clean energy development being a key part of adaptation and resilience and economic opportunity for tribal nations. And I see investments in community solar and microgrids, building climate resilience across the country, but also providing those enormous, as you called, outsized economic opportunities. Could you give us a few examples or two of clean energy projects in tribal communities and the broader impacts they're having?
Yeah, so again, you know, the Blue Lake Rancheria, which I think is in Representative Huffman's district, there are, thankfully, over the last few years or so, there's been a real shift in federal financing for these smaller community scale distributed energy projects because they provide lots of different benefits to tribes. One, first and foremost, jobs, right? These are the kind, you can't outsource these jobs and you can't automate these jobs. So they provide jobs for tribal members. They provide added economic benefit of reducing energy costs, right? If I offset that power cost, I don't pay the utility. I get to keep those funds in the community and reinvest them in the tribal community. If it's operated by a tribal utility, again, I'm creating more jobs through that tribal utility. And you see this around the whole country. There's been a very broad geographic effort from Washington State with the Spokane tribe down to the Seminole tribe in Florida and everywhere in between, a very robust diversification of renewable energy projects at the smaller scale level. And that's because everybody can do smaller scale renewable energy projects. And so that's been critical. We see lots of new tribes come out with energy economy opportunities for job training and putting tribal members to work in installing solar panels and doing energy efficiency. We've got to operate and maintain those systems. So these are sustainable jobs. These aren't just 600 people building a big solar project and then, as I say, 3 guys in a bottle of Windex taking care of it later. So there's
in fact, Chairman Baker highlighted that the Southern Ute have developed a utility scale solar that's reduced their dependence on fossil fuels. So Chairman Baker, why did you all make the decision to diversify your energy resources? And Chairman, I have run out of time, so let's we'll be sure to come back to you. So we'll give you some time to think about your answer on that, and I'll have to go to Ranking Member Graves for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
And Chairman Baker, I think you're on mute as well. Hey, hey, thanks again to all of you for participating today. I really appreciate y'all's testimony. Chairman Baker, y'all have pursued, as the chair just noted, both solar as well as conventional fuel projects that all result in net zero emissions. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of just innovation and innovative technologies in helping the tribe achieve your kind of financial health and sustainability baseload power for your tribe?
Yes, the Coyote Clean Power Project has the potential to positively benefit the Southern Indian tribe and the local community by providing clean, affordable baseload power to the grid in part of the country where coal plants are continuing to be retired over the coming years. Additionally, the Coyote Clean Power Project will be located on the Southern Indian Reservation, creating employment opportunities in the community. Per federal law, the project will be giving contracting preference for Indian-owned businesses and hiring enrolled Native Americans to support the project. During the peak of the construction, it is anticipated that the project will create over 1,000 indirect and direct jobs. Post-construction and during the operational period, it is anticipated that the project will directly create 2 to 3 dozen direct jobs, providing local high-tech employment opportunities for the community, along with future indirect job creation. So we're always looking toward, how can we implement job opportunities for our membership?
So it's job opportunities and it's financial assistance to the tribe as well. There was an article from the Associated Press in June of this year that noted that that there was a boom in Native American oil activity and how that potentially complicates what the Biden administration is doing. If the administration comes in and tries to prohibit or stop tribes from producing conventional fuels, and as we've talked about, in some cases with net zero emissions, what does that do to the Southern Ute? You're on mute.
Oh, yeah,
You're good.
Since the project consumes fossil fuels, why would the Southern Ute develop a project that consumes fossil fuels given the concerns on climate change? First, we believe that all energy development has some type of environmental impact. And when we evaluate projects, we look at the environmental and social impacts through the entire life cycle of the project, which can induce air emissions, climate change, water and land use, wildlife, waste generation, labor, etc. The Coyote Clean Power Project utilizes natural gas, which we see as playing a big role in the overall energy transition due to the fact that it is readily available in the United States, has a lower carbon footprint than other types of fossil fuels, and when coupled with innovative technologies such as all the LM fed power cycle can eliminate air pollutants associated with combustion and capture over 97% of the CO2 generated from the project for sequestration. The project is truly an innovative way to supply affordable baseload power to the grid while providing solutions to climate change. To summarize into 3 buckets: fossil fuels can be used cleanly. Fossil fuels still make up more than 80% of the energy consumed around the world. Carbon capture.
So, Mr. Chairman, it sounds like y'all have your own process where you review kind of from beginning to end and look at it and determine just holistically if this is the right move for the tribe. And that's a great process, and I think something that doesn't discriminate against energy technologies. President Sharp, I'm curious a couple of things. One, there were some quotes from you earlier this year where you basically said you were going to, quote, take big oil down. Hearing from Chairman Baker about their ability to use conventional fuels in a way that's net zero emissions, I'm curious as to how those two things align.
Yes, I really appreciate that question because in that context, I'm very passionate about taking big oil down, because when you look at the scale of the global crisis that we're all facing, the public treasury is having to pay for it. And every single day, big oil is emitting, polluting and denigrating our environment with no consequence. There's no carbon fee. And so that's my intent, that big oil should be held accountable for devastating our natural world and putting the price tag on the public treasury. Now, with regard to any tribal nation's ability and desire to build their own fuel sources and energy, we fully support that. And to reconcile those two things, we're in a period of transition. We need to transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And there is a space and a window and opportunity, and we support any tribal nation's desire to unlock the energy potential within their own sovereign lands.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to make note the Biden administration ignored the Navajo tribe whenever they asked for an appropriate buffer. And they put a ban in place. So the administration's not listening to tribes. In regard to President Fawn's comments, President Sharp's comments, the reality is it's for every 1 ton of emissions the United States has reduced, the global community has increased by 10 tons. And so it's not the United States. Yield back.
Next, we'll go to Rep. Bonamici.
Thank you to the chair and ranking members and to our witnesses. I want to note that the title of this hearing includes tribal voices, tribal wisdom. And I just note that as policymakers, we benefit greatly when we listen to tribal voices and we heed the tribal wisdom which our witnesses brought to this hearing today. Many of the witnesses have spoken either in their oral or written testimony about the expertise of tribal nations in natural resource management and the value of Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. On November 15th, the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the White House Council on Environmental Quality released a memo detailing the administration's commitment to elevating Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge in federal policymaking processes. And that includes the convening of an interagency work group. This work group will promote mutually beneficial partnerships between the federal government and tribal communities on Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. So I want to ask Dr. Thornbrew, what would you like to see this working group consider as it prepares the guidance document for release next year? And what recommendations do you expect the guidance will ultimately offer?
Thank you, Representative Bonamici. The main things I would like to see, of course, is clear communication with tribal nations to respect the proprietary information around traditional ecological knowledge. We're really, we are excited that it is brought higher to the forefront. But as processes go, ongoing communication is so important. And I want to also highlight President Sharp in terms of the continued importance of FPIC, that this is knowledge that comes from our histories, from, very much part of who we are. So it's important to have the utmost respect for it, but also our consent and how it's applied. So I would just say, in conclusion, just continuing that respect and regular communication. That way, if issues or concerns come up, they come up sooner rather than later.
Thank you. That's very helpful. President Sharp, welcome. It's very nice to see you again. I will always remember the beautiful traditional invocation your son provided when you were here at the Capitol previously. I want to thank you for the important contributions of the National Congress of American Indians and what those contributions meant to this committee's climate action plan. Tribal feedback on the climate action plan, as well as comments in your testimony, reflect the challenges that tribal nations and intergovernmental tribal groups face in accessing federal programs and funding. And you mentioned that in your testimony again today. Tribal entities like the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, or CRITFIC, and in the Pacific Northwest have told me about some of those challenges they've had in accessing federal grants and programs. So President Sharp, how can we make sure that tribal nations and entities have equitable access to federal energy and climate programs? And how does maintaining the status quo, or how would maintaining the status quo undermine our collective response to the climate crisis?
Excellent. And before I begin to answer the two questions, I do want to touch back on the previous question, which I answered. When you look at the scale of the climate crisis facing this country and this world, relying almost entirely on the public treasury, appropriations through state capitals, state legislatures, and Congress is simply not enough. We do have to hold big oil accountable and those who are directly responsible. But of the limited public treasury, it's important that tribal nations have a steady and a secure source of multi-year funding. It's very difficult to plan. Climate resiliency projects are multi-year, if not multi-generational. So it's critically important that we do have a reliable and steady source of revenues and as Congress works to hold those who are accountable responsible. And I would also suggest in a lot of conversations, there's a discussion of public-private partnerships to fund climate-related impacts. So anything Congress can do to incentivize public-private partnerships, to hold big oil accountable, to pay their fair share and price for centuries of devastation, and creating a framework for us to be able to access those directly from congressional appropriations would be incredibly helpful.
Thank you. And what would be, how would it undermine the collective response if you did not have access to that funding?
It would undermine the response in that tribal nations are already left vulnerable with little to no resources, as is evidenced in the UN Commission on Human Rights, that was Civil Commission on Human Rights that was delivered to Congress. We are chronically underfunded. And so without the added support of addressing climate change, you take that away. And the impacts of COVID-19 has revealed just how critically vulnerable tribal nations are. So we would see our lands, our resources, our territories, even our traditional foods and plants disappear, and they're already disappearing. So it would prove to be devastating for Indian country.
Thank you. And I'm over time, but I just want to note as I yield back, I hope you stayed safe during the atmospheric river events in the Pacific Northwest. We had some serious flooding recently. Take care. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Next up, Rep. Palmer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman. And I thank the witnesses for being here. Chairman Baker, I'm hopeful that one thing we can learn from the tribes is that the climate has a history. I keep bringing this up. I keep hearing a misappropriation of historical data and in some cases scientific data. And my colleagues on the committee have complained since I've been on it that fossil fuels are causing all the droughts and that the world faces. And my question is if the use of fossil fuels is causing current droughts, what caused the droughts that took place in the southwestern United States in the mid 13th century that resulted in the disappearance of tribes like the Anastasies? Do you have any idea? I believe you're muted.
Yes, currently I don't have any ideas, but we see that all around us in our Southwest region where, again, we're close to where like Mesa Verde ruins, and the history tells us, how they lived, how they survived. And we hear stories of the water levels that were higher back in the day. There was plenty of water. And today, this whole region is drying up in our area. We're in a drought, high drought for the year. Our lakes in the area are really, really drying up. So with like anything else, I guess just like our past ancestors, you have to adapt and figure out a way to survive, whatever it is, at all means, in all costs. And, right now that is a big issue for us. Again, the water, the drought, what's it going to look like in 5 years? So our teams are always looking for answers.
Well, actually, Professor Scott Stein, who spent decades studying tree stumps in parts of the Sierra Nevada, found that past century has been among the wettest in the last 7,000 years. He also notes that the tree ring data shows that California had a 240-year drought that started in 850 AD, over 1,000 years before fossil fuels, power like coal plants and oil were used. And my point is and that includes the Mississippian culture. Where I grew up, I lived near mounds, near Hamilton, Alabama. There's mounds south of Tuscaloosa near Florence, Alabama. There was a thriving culture, Mississippian culture, that disappeared because of a major drought that occurred around 1300, 1350. And the point that I'm trying to make is that we spend all this time attacking big oil, and I think it's because people have self-interest involved, and the science doesn't support a lot of what's being said. But the historical record, the geologic record, shows that the climate changes all the time for a number of reasons. And the indigenous peoples of America, and I have Native American background as well, and that I'm very proud of, didn't have the technological ability to develop the natural resources to mitigate and adapt to the climate change. They had to migrate. And that's what happened with the Anastasies. I think they assimilated eventually into the Navajo tribe. But we keep focusing on these things that even some of the top scientists that this committee's brought in have admitted that if we completely eliminated all CO2 emissions, it wouldn't stop climate change. We've imposed restrictions on Native Americans, particularly on the reservations. It was a few years ago that the Energy Information Administration put out data that showed that 14% of the Native Americans on reservations had no access to electricity. Chairman Baker, do you think it's right for the federal government to deprive the tribes the right to utilize the natural resources that exist on their tribal lands, to develop a power plant if they want to, a hydroelectric plant, natural gas, or even oil? Because there are literally reservations where people are suffering from energy poverty and living in poverty because you haven't been able to do that.
No, I don't think it's right at all. You know, it's very, you know, it's just not fair for all Native country, all around, all Indian country. But, you know, again, you know, for us, we're looking at self-determination as far as what can we do? How do we move forward? You know, we never stop. We have great teams in place. We collaborate with others. We do a lot of research as we move forward, no matter what the issue is. And not only when we talk about, you know, the energy and all that, our tribe, we also diversify in many other aspects, real estate, just many things out there in this world that we're always thinking, we're always moving. We can't focus on just one, but when we are focused on one, like this clean energy, you know, we know CO2 is a greenhouse gas, you know, these types of things, we're never going to stop moving forward and sharing that experience with other tribes. When we talk about meeting and coming together, we do have tribes that want to meet with us and come and ask us, how did you do it? And we're more than willing to share that story with anyone who wants to come and meet with our team.
I congratulate you on your commitment to your people. I yield back.
Thank you.
Next up, Representative Escobar, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, for bringing us together in this hearing. And I'd like to also express my gratitude to our panelists for sharing their wisdom and for participating with us here today. I am so proud that we have the Isleta del Sur Pueblo in El Paso, which is the oldest tribal community in the state of Texas, and the Tigua Tribal Council is the oldest government in the state as well. The Pueblo, just like most other Native groups, continues to depend on the land and its resources, not just to further their way of life, but also as part of their spiritual practices. But of course, the climate crisis has completely changed what is available to them, and they have shared their concerns with me about drought and lack of access to water and the dire impacts that it has had on them, and their ability to preserve that important way of life. I had the privilege yesterday of meeting with Governor Silvas from the Tigua tribe, and one of the concerns he shared with me is the inflexibility that exists with government funding that is tied to the tribe. And so I actually want to explore that a little bit so that we can better understand what we can do in order to provide the flexibility necessary so that the resources, especially as they relate to addressing the climate crisis and being able to fully utilize them to avert disaster. I'd like to explore what some of those impediments and roadblocks have been for some of our panelists. And so President Sharp, in your testimony, you had mentioned the need for the federal government to provide funds directly to tribes and through multi-year grants. Could you share with the committee how these changes would accelerate projects on the ground? And if possible, is there an example you can think of that you can share with us?
Yes, I really appreciate the question because the issues that you raise affect every tribal nation in the United States that are on the front lines of dealing with climate change. And I'll give you an example from my community. In the 1950s and 60s, we had millions of sockeye blueback salmon return to the mighty Quinault, and the Quinault River is just out my window here. Millions, and that was from when time began, from time immemorial. The year I got elected in 2006, we only had 3,000 blueback return. And our scientists have been doing a tremendous amount of work in adapting and mitigating those impacts, constructing engineered log jams, et cetera. But we are at a place now where we don't even have the resources to really understand the scope of the problem. And with all tribal nations, having a direct source of funding would provide us with the capacity to begin to do some of the identifying of the problem. And then based on identifying the science and having the capacity to do that, then build out adaptation and mitigation strategies. We don't even have the resources to fully wrap our minds around all of the scientific implications of what's happening. So if we had a dedicated source of funding, we would be able to clearly identify the challenges that our communities are facing, identify the goals and objectives related to climate resilience, and be able to point to our partners, whether it's a federal governments and agencies, state, or even the private sector. But until we have the resources to really understand the scope of our challenges, we are just simply literally putting out fires.
Thank you so much. Ms. Thomas, what are some of the other roadblocks that make it difficult for tribes to access federal funds for clean energy and resilience in particular, and how would you recommend we fix them?
Thank you very much. So being a former Fed and having worked on policy and programs at the Department of Energy, the primary challenge around accessing federal support is the multiple silos that exist, right? There's a great number. I think by our last count, there were about 75 federal programs across 9 agencies that could be leveraged for energy development, for energy efficiency, for weatherization, whether it's LIHEAP and HHS, or the Weatherization Assistance Program at DOE, or the EDA program, Economic Administration out of Commerce. So aligning federal programs, aligning them in such a way that give tribes the flexibility and the not just the resources, but really the flexibility in leveraging those resources. And so that's a function of mostly statute, but also regulation and other guidance that the federal agencies have implemented. And so a good starting point would be, much as the president has just announced a task force around tribal consultation, additional task forces around how to make the federal programs more accessible to tribes and tribal communities as they're trying to put together and piece together federal funds that help do. As I mentioned, a microgrid project can be a $20 million project. So I can go get that money from 6 or 7 different agencies, but it's a very challenging and daunting process to do that.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Next up, Rep. Huffman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Madam Chair, and thanks so much for this hearing. Welcome to our witnesses. Ranking Member Graves, of course, piqued my interest with his opening remarks about, a Wright brothers moment, a breakthrough on carbon capture, utilization, and storage using natural gas to push electricity onto the grid in a net zero way. And as I was trying to follow the testimony, as I was also digging into whatever information I could find about this. And my mind remains open to any technology that can help us achieve zero emissions and meet our goals. But I'm not sure that this really is the Wright brothers moment from what I can gather about this pilot project in Texas. And I do want to ask you a little more about your larger project, Chairman Baker, using the same technology, because I'm curious about it. But from what I can gather, this at best is a more efficient way of creating a cycle that burns natural gas and captures the CO2. But we haven't yet figured out what to do with that CO2. And it looks like it's just going to the same old thing, enhanced oil recovery. So I think you're taking great liberties with the term net zero. when you're talking about burning natural gas and then using the CO2 that you can mostly capture through that process, and then just going out and developing more oil to be burned in cars and other fossil fuel uses. That is not a climate solution. That's just oil and gas business as usual. And so I remain pretty skeptical, but let's continue the conversation for sure. And the problem I have with representing this as a breakthrough is that right now, adding new renewables to generate electricity is actually cheaper than natural gas electricity that doesn't capture the carbon. So you add in the costs of carbon capture and then all of the uncertainties about what you do with that CO2 after you capture it. No one's yet been able to figure out a way to safely and reliably store it so that it doesn't get into the atmosphere. There's just reason for skepticism, I believe. And so let me ask you, if I could, Chairman Baker, and I applaud you for the solar project that you've pursued and the leadership you're showing in trying to develop clean energy. As you look at expanding the use of this technology, what are you going to do with the CO2?
Okay, thank you for the question. Our plan is to store the CO2 in ground. And also, we don't develop oil on a reservation. You know, we do a lot of outside the reservation. As we've grown, our energy department, you know, we're all over the place, you know, not just strictly on our reservation. And as well as for oil, we don't do that on our reservation. It's all natural gas. But the plan is to store the CO2 in the ground.
Have you identified a place that and demonstrated that you can safely store it over the long term without leakage and other problems?
Could you repeat that question?
Yeah, have you found a place to safely store it without leakage or other problems, or are you just going to have someone else take care of that?
Okay, I am off mute. I was lost for a second. Okay, you know, right now, that's kind of like confidential information as our team moves forward. I think we're still working on it. We're not saying that we do have the answer, but as anything else, we're progressing toward that. I'm sure once we develop that and come up with a plan, you know, because again, like we've said from day one, we're always looking out to protect our reservation, our homelands, you know, whether it's within our area and all that, but we don't have that. It's information that our team is working on is confidential at this point because we're not yet at the finish line. We're still trying to develop it and always doing things in the right way, not just for our reservation, but for the whole earth, as well as our sister tribes across Indian country.
Okay, but you're not going to just, you know, pipe it off somewhere to be used for enhanced oil recovery?
No, that's not in the works yet. You know, again, we don't have that answer. We're looking at various opportunities of what's the right way, what's the best way, because again, at times, but it is possible to do that if we find the right, you know, mechanism of how that can go, where it can go in a safe manner. But again, we're still at the, you know, still working on all these issues because again, we don't want to present something without all the facts, looking into it. And
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. And I really do appreciate your leadership in these issues and what you're trying to do for your tribe. But as with so many other instances where we've heard about, you know, the great promise of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, when you ask the hard questions, it's not quite ready for prime time. And meanwhile, renewables are cheaper than natural gas. So I hope we keep our focus there. And with that, I yield back.
Next up, Rep. Crenshaw, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. To Chairman Baker, your answer can simply be we can do whatever we want because of tribal sovereignty. So that can be your answer. Let's debunk a couple things. No, renewables are not cheaper than natural gas. That is complete nonsense. Complete nonsense. They're only cheaper because they get massive subsidies to make them cheaper. There's not a single manufacturer of solar panels or wind turbines or generators that I've talked to that say they could do this in an open and free market. Oh, but oil and gas get subsidies too. That's what they say. Lies. Another lie that needs to be debunked. There's no direct tax credits. There's no direct subsidies to oil and gas. Here's another lie that needs to be debunked. Carbon capture technology is not ready for market. Lies. Illinois is starting a project. Chairman Baker is talking about this project here in Colorado. Houston has already piloted it, and we just hooked it up to the energy grid. It's profitable. The only thing they used is a 45Q tax credit. These things are profitable, they work, and in some cases they're carbon negative because the technology exists, and it's well-developed technology that pipes that well underground and saves it for 10,000 years.
Point of order, Madam Chair. The gentleman is welcome to disagree with me and make points, but I would ask that his words be taken down for accusing me of lying.
Oh, well, your hurt feelings are noted.
Gentlemen,
if I may continue.
So you're not, would you like to yield to Mr. Huffman, Mr. Crenshaw?
No, I will not yield.
Okay.
I would like to yield to Mr. Baker. Chairman Baker, do you think that a person can be in the business of natural gas and also care about the environment?
Yes. As I've always mentioned, we as a tribe, we are caretakers of the land. We've always been raised that way. No matter where we are, we're always going to have our land come first and be careful and, how it affects our neighbors.
And tribal lands are not exempt from this natural gas tax that's going to be in the reconciliation bill. Any member of your tribe that operates a facility that produces, transmits, processes, or otherwise touches natural gas will be subject to a tax as assessed purely by the EPA. So how will this harm the members of the Southern Ute tribe?
I'm not sure exactly how that would, because again, like I said, we have so many other things that we work on that benefit our tribe, not just oil and gas, and again, the lack of snow, lack of rainfall, and, a lot of that does cause the droughts that are in our area. But again, that is a great question. I'm not the technical expert on this technology, but in the room with Courtney Hadrick, the operating director of our energy, and Coy Bryant, and the government should not tax our resources.
Right, I agree with that. And to address this, again, back to the general discussion of natural gas. Again, the facts are that natural gas and fracking industry and the technology associated with that it is almost 100% responsible for our reduction in emissions in this country back to 1992 levels. There's no disputing that. There's no disputing the fact that if we were to replace coal-fired power plants around the world with our U.S. natural gas, you'd have more reduction in emissions than in any other solution that we're talking about here. And look, to Mr. Huffman, I don't mean to call you a liar, and I'll just apologize for that. But what you're saying is deeply, deeply untrue and misleading, and frankly, probably damaging to our mutual goals of reducing emissions in this country and around the world. That's the truth. That's the truth, and the facts back this up. The facts back up that these technologies, carbon capture technologies, are indeed ready for market. It's happening right before our eyes. And we can refuse to acknowledge it. We can cover our ears and cover our eyes and pretend we don't see it and pretend that renewables are cheaper and that they're more effective and that they're reliable. We can pretend all that. We can write a fiction novel about it. But none of it will be true. It will never be true. And to over-subsidize those technologies, renewable technologies, to the detriment of reliable clean technologies like carbon capture and nuclear energy is insanity. It's insanity, especially at a moment around the world where people are having trouble keeping the lights on. That's a very, very bad place to be in. I yield back.
Yield the balance this time?
Yes, I will.
I thank the gentleman. The National Carbon Capture Center is in my district, and I would be happy to host the committee if they want to visit that. We're sequestering carbon and concrete blocks and other materials. There's no leaking or leaching. And I do think that it might be good for the committee to have an expanded view of what's actually happening in regard to that technology. And I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
Well, thank you for that offer, Mr. Palmer. We all know that there is a role for carbon capture and storage when it comes to industrial processes like concrete and steel. But as I think Mr. Huffman makes a very strong point, is still unproven when it comes to oil and gas. So next we're going to go up to Rep. Caston. You're recognized for. Oh, Mr. McEachin is going to go first. We recognize Rep. McEachin for 5 minutes.
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, you caught me off guard. I thought it was Rep. Caston, but I will go ahead since he's being kind to me today. Madam Chair, first of all, thank you for convening today's hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for joining this hearing. Across the nation, communities are feeling the impacts of climate change, and of course, that includes Native American tribes and Indigenous people in my district. Like other historically underrepresented people, Indigenous groups have been disproportionately impacted by the impacts of climate change. According to experts, this is part attributable to the historic wrongs that led to tribal lands dispossession and forced migration to less economically productive lands. As I've said before, access to clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment should not be a luxury. And as we've seen, we need to make sure that as we go forward, we address the climate crisis to move towards a clean energy future. The Select Committee has made recommendations as to how to ensure this is the case. And President Biden is committed to doing so as well through the Justice 40 Initiative, a goal of delivering 40% of overall benefits of the relevant federal investments to disadvantaged communities, including tribal communities. I look forward to working with my colleagues and with the administration to ensure that we follow through on this promise and that our tribal nations have the resources and capacity to address climate threats and take advantage of the opportunities presented by the ongoing clean energy transition. Pardon me. This question is for all three witnesses. And I would just ask that you take it in the order that you answer in the order that you gave your testimony. You know, when drafting the Environmental Justice for All Act, it was critical to me to get feedback from a variety of stakeholders on the legislation, including tribal and Indigenous leaders. As new policies are created and grants are distributed from the infrastructure package, can you please clarify how you feel the federal government can best ensure meaningful stakeholder engagement, including the types of engagement that would be most helpful?
Thank you. I'll go first. I really appreciate not only the question, but that background, because it is so important for everybody to understand and recognize the place of not only Indigenous peoples, but communities of color as disproportionately impacted. The one thing that I could offer and suggest that would be very helpful is to formalize the engagement of tribal nations on climate policy. As Pilar mentioned, we have to deal with various silos within the federal government, but to consolidate and be able to provide a national climate strategy that is both informed as well as engaging tribal nations at every level would be helpful. And I can say, as representing 574 tribal nations, that we are prepared, we are ready. We just need to have those multiple points of opportunity to bring not only our traditional knowledge, but our innovation and the things that we are doing across Indian country. So we welcome any opportunity, and I thank you for that question.
All right, I have less than 2 minutes, but please continue, folks. All right, Ms. Thomas, would you answer the next one, please?
Sure, I think so. You know, there's lots of ways to have lots of methods for engagement. And, you know, you have your national tribal organizations, such as NCAI. You have the regional organizations, such as USET, where Casey works, and those all over the country. The biggest challenge as well, though, is with direct tribal communities. And as much as there's a government to government relationship that the federal government has to uphold at all levels, sometimes the voices of individual tribal members and tribal communities, those have to be brought to the table as well. So there's a multi-level challenge that the federal government has, but as with anything, The big thing is, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. You got to just get started. So, we got to do maybe some things a little bit differently, and hopefully some of the models that this administration is putting together will be a good way to do that. We've got to find natural allies and partners who are in the same boat, and try and create partnerships across communities of color, across organizations, and across levels of government, and encouraging tribes, for example, to engage with their cities and counties, and as well as with state government, is another way to come at this.
Well, thank you for those answers, Dr. Thornburg, and to the chairman. I'm not going to try to get you all to answer in less than 20 seconds, but I would ask that you just send us an answer to that question, if you would. It's a sincere question, and we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we have the right communication between, obviously, tribal and indigenous peoples, but all folks who have been disadvantaged by the climate crisis. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Rep. McEachin. Next, we'll go to Rep. Caston. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thanks to our witnesses. I want to start just by apologizing. It breaks my heart that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem to have climbed in a time machine this morning and gone back to 1995 and said that the climate's always changing, the fossil fuel industry isn't subsidized, that people who would suggest that have special interests. My goodness. We had $100 billion of damage this year, real people who lost their homes from fires and floods, and we're going to talk about tree ring data? The International Monetary Fund says that the world subsidizes the fossil fuel industry by $6 trillion a year, $650 billion in the US. And we're going to call those lies? Show some respect for this committee, for the science, and for the planet that we all call home. My goodness. I want to try to end on an optimistic note, but I want to start, President Sharp, with a question for you. And it's a hard question for me to grapple with, and I'm hoping that you've got more wisdom than me on this. For not all of the tribes in our country, but for an awful lot of them, the lands they live on are lands that they were forcibly relocated to. We moved them off productive land, we moved them to more marginal land, and an awful lot of that land is now areas that in many cases is most at risk of climate change. The areas that are harder to obtain water, more at risk of drought. I see you nodding your head. My question for you is, the number one, are the programs that we have available in this country for adaptation sufficient for those communities, and can they get access to them? And number two, to the extent that those folks are living in areas where the best thing to do is to help folks relocate to a more productive area, how can we be most culturally sensitive for communities that have been told by the federal government to move before and maybe a little bit skeptical? And would welcome your thoughts on both of those questions.
Yes.
With the hope that I can end with a little bit of time for President Thomas or Dr. Thomas before we're done.
Yes, thank you. And to your first question, adaptation funding is simply not enough. And we need additional resources to begin to not only adapt with new and emerging science and the things that are readily available, but the centuries of knowledge that we have with respect to adaptation, and cultivating and developing that with our elders is critically important. To your second question, yes, how can we make those adjustments and moves in a more culturally sensitive way? The one way to do that is to acknowledge that tribal nations should have a decisive say through free, prior, and informed consent on all federal actions. When the United States or any other government can take unilateral action without our consent, it puts us in an imperiled position. So those are the two suggestions that I would offer. Thank you.
Thank you. And moving to Dr. Thomas, and I want to try to end on a more uplifting note. We talk a lot about the pain of climate change, and I think sometimes we talk too little about the economic gain. Notwithstanding what some of my colleagues seem to suggest, if you invest in things that have no marginal operating costs, you make a lot of money. It's pretty awesome. There's reasons why the private sector likes this. In your former capacity as the Deputy Director of the DOE's Office of Indian Energy Policy, I wonder if you could comment on, we have all these programs to try to make sure that we are investing dollars in the areas where we have the maximum opportunity for renewable resources, where the wind resources are, where the solar resources are. You talked a little about that in your opening testimony. are the programmatic ways that we get money into Indian country sufficient to make sure that those monies flow to the optimal places, notwithstanding where the land is and who lives on it? Or are there things we can do to tweak and better accelerate this transition to a cleaner and cheaper future?
So as I had mentioned before, the biggest challenge is the silos within the agencies themselves and across agencies, and being able to leverage as much federal support as possible, whether it's technical assistance or financial assistance, between rural development and RUS's programs, the Department of Energy's programs, Department of Interior's programs. Piecing these all together can be a huge challenge. Everybody's got a different calendar. Everybody's got a different set of criteria for what kind of projects work. The commercial scale projects, the two commercial scale projects didn't use any federal money from a grant standpoint. They use tax credits, but those projects are so big that the small amounts, relatively small amounts of federal money don't really help with the commercial scale. Now, financial assistance, yes. And these smaller scale projects where tribes can use their wind and solar for themselves, that's really where the federal support becomes more impactful. And you see less of the private sector, at least right now, being interested in supporting, a 20 kilowatt solar project. So the federal support becomes more important there. So really the big opportunity for the administration, I think, as with any administration, is how do we better coordinate amongst ourselves? And part of that really should start with asking the tribes who are trying to develop projects, what do you need from us, and what can we do from the federal government perspective to support that effort?
Thank you. I see I'm out of time. Really appreciate your response. Yield back.
Well, thank you very much. As we close out the hearing, I would like to provide the witnesses with 1 minute each to give us some closing advice and wisdom. And let's go in reverse order and start with Ms. Thomas. 1 minute for closing words to us.
So I usually just try and end, usually when I talk about this, with two key concepts. One, tribal sovereign authorities. Tribes aren't going to be able to accomplish most of what they need to do from a clean energy and from a climate resiliency standpoint if they don't have the federal government support for them exercising their own sovereign authorities for what makes sense for the tribal community. And then secondly, I do think the federal government could be more ambitious around supporting mass deployment of whatever technology works for the tribes around climate resiliency. And that's going to require putting our shoulder to the grindstone to really figure out what is it we can do. We can plan, we can assess, and President Sharp is right. We still need more money for that. But in the end, we've got to actually do something to protect ourselves. And so that's going to require more federal government coordination in that regard.
Dr. Thornbrew.
Thank you. So first and foremost, it's important for tribal nations to be the leaders and to guide traditional ecological knowledge initiatives. I also want to highlight direct funding for tribal nations for climate change adaptation and resilience. Competitive funding puts a burden on the tribal nations and is not representative of the trust and treaty obligation. Also, I want to mention it's important for early consultation with tribal nations. We need the time to look at initiatives and understand how they impact our nations and communities in that way. So early consultation. I want to just mention a couple brief things on the climate change side. We recognize that climate has changed throughout geologic time. In the Northeast where I live, it took 10,000 years for the glacier, the Laurentide ice to recede. We're looking at changes within 100 years or within lifetimes. Thank you.
Mr. Baker.
Thank you. And I want to thank everyone for participating in this. It was some good discussion. I believe that everyone on this call contributed to emissions in our atmosphere We weren't here to debate climate change. We're here to promote working together with different views, with open minds, to put real world solutions in place as we move forward. And we advocate for our sovereignty and work nation to nation around the world to solve the problems. You know, as it's always been mentioned, who knows best about their own homelands than the natives that live within their own reservations. You know, we know what we got to do as caretakers of the land. So, and also we would like to invite anyone who would like to come and tour what we're working on our reservation here at Southern Ute. So thank you for allowing me to speak today in regard to this testimony.
Thank you. And President Sharp.
Yes, Seoquil. My 1 minute, I would like to just encourage every member of the committee to continue to advance as leaders of this country with bold and courageous and decisive climate action. We are running out of time. And I would like to leave you with this thought. From our perspective, there's no way we're going to be able to negotiate, legislate, or buy our way out of this climate crisis. We have to return to our traditional lifeways that the indigenous peoples of this continent have exercised for millennia. And that's my one takeaway from COP26. When I worked with indigenous peoples all over the world, it's very clear we do manage 80% of the world's biodiversity. And it's only with us at the table to bring that timeless knowledge to restore balance to this planet. We can't take selective science to advance political objectives that benefit multinational corporations who seem to suggest that the health and future of our planet and even humanity is reduced to nothing more than a cost of doing business. We have to be bold, courageous, speak truth, and speak honest truth as we navigate through this crisis. Seoquil, thank you.
Well, thank you to all of our witnesses for your tribal wisdom and advice to the Congress. We certainly need it. So I'll go to Representative Graves for unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I ask unanimous consent. The statement from the Navajo Nation regarding the Biden administration's actions on Chaco Canyon be included in the record. Secondly, an article regarding the Net Power facility on dispatching zero emission natural gas generated electricity to the grid. And then lastly, an analysis by C2ES, which is a Pew Associated group that make note that I believe the former head of it is now working for John Kerry in the administration, that has an analysis of carbon capture and sequestration that lists the number of successful projects over decades.
Thank you, Rep. Graves. And as I close out the hearing, I do want to say that I know that members are strong advocates for their communities back home and their policy positions, but members like Representative Crenshaw, his remarks today really crossed the line when he spoke in terms of lies and liars. That violates our rules of decorum here in the House, and it was appropriate for him to apologize to Representative Huffman today, and I'm glad he did that, especially when it comes to, and I'll offer this as a unanimous consent request, his assertion that there are no oil and gas doesn't receive subsidies from the U.S. government. So all without objection, I'll enter into the record a September 2021 report from the International Monetary Fund titled "Still Not Getting Energy Prices Right, a Global and Country Update of Fossil Fuel Subsidies," and finding that globally, fossil fuel subsidies were $5.9 trillion in 2020, as Rep. Caston mentioned. Also, an October 21 resolution from the National Congress of American Indians titled "Amending and Updating NCAI Resolution SD-15-024 and Supporting Tribal Disaster Resilience and Climate Change Principles," and an October 2021 resolution from the National Congress of American Indians titled "Additional Tribal Disaster Resilience and Climate Change Common Principles." Without objection, all members will have 10 business days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses. I ask our witnesses to respond promptly as you are able. Thank you all, and the committee is adjourned.